Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the team Calcutta Comparatists 1919, I take this privilege to welcome you to the 77th lecture of the CC19 lecture series. Calcutta Comparatists 1919 is an independent forum for research scholars of humanities and social sciences. It carries the legacy of academic study of Indian languages and literatures envisioned by Sir Ashutosh Mukherjee and introduced in 1919 at the University of Calcutta. It is a platform for sharing research. We are organizing online lectures on various interdisciplinary topics to be delivered by academicians and distinguished research scholars of different fields. Your remarkable skills will be a great addition to our team. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you Biproda for joining us today. I'll hand over the mic to Jemima Nasrin now, and she'll introduce our speaker of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Arapchikati. Today we have with us Dr. Bipranarayan Bhattacharyya. Dr. Bipranarayan Bhattacharyya is an assistant professor in the Department of English, Government of General Degree College, Kharagpur-II. He has completed his PhD on late Victorian popular fiction from the Department of English, Kazi Nazrul University. He has previously taught in several institutions like Kazi Nazrul University, Scottish Church College, and the Heritage College. His areas of interest include Victorian studies, children's literature, and popular culture. Thank you, Biproda, for joining us today. Now, this virtual stage is yours. You may kindly begin your lecture.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jemima. And I'm extremely thankful to Calcutta Comparatists, Aratrika, Jemima, Protim, and the others for providing me this wonderful platform. Uh, Especially as I'll be speaking on the great Satyajit Ray, as I insist on calling him, not Ray, as a lot of people are fond of calling him. Since, yeah, I always insist on saying that Ray is something that the non-Bengalis call him because they can't probably pronounce Roy properly. But since we are able to do that, why should not we call him as Satyajit Ray instead of the anglicized Ray? So, yeah, my topic will be Satyajit Ray's fiction because as I was speaking with Jemima the other day when I told her, when she asked me that what you will be speaking on, I told her that maybe something on Satyajit Ray's fiction because a lot of people already talk a lot about his films, right? And it's always the fiction which I think still remains a bit neglected. So, my topic is going to be a wholesome alternative questioning neoliberal capitalism in Satyajit Ray's fiction. Uh, to begin without much ado, then, Ashish Nundi, in his book Satyajit Ray's Secret Guide to Exquisite Murders, says that as a person, Rai lived in the pre-war bicultural world of Rabindranath Tagore that had a touch of Edwardian England. Rai saw himself as a Renaissance man in the tradition of the great Calcuttans of the last century. Well, it's certainly true that Rai had it in him, a definite touch of the Renaissance man who does a lot of things at once. He himself uh, said it in various interviews that he feels the creative gene, the same creative gene that was in his forefathers, it came down to him. Upendra Kishore, of course, was a painter, editor, writer, artist, musician, and he was especially prolific in playing the violin, as we know. Shukumar was also a writer, editor, printer, artist, musician, and whatnot. Satyajit saw himself as a direct descendant of that multi-talented lineage, let's say. So there was definitely a touch of the Renaissance man in him. However, I want to argue that though Satyajit took his cue from the humanist principles propounded by his forefathers, and simultaneously he also transformed it into something else, a worldview that can serve as a wholesome alternative to the neoliberal capitalistic forces prevalent in his times. I argue that his fiction, written mostly for a predominantly male young adult readership, should not be dismissed as frivolous, but rather consistently as a medium for expressing this particular worldview. Indeed, we often forget that besides entertainment, young adult literature often performs the important task of socializing the young reader with his surrounding life and times as he she grown citizen. This is something which I had always tried to be very aware about, that in treating young adult literature as something frivolous, as several people tend to do, they often forget this very important task that the young adult literature performs. Every young adult book, I think any great young adult writer, he or she is bound to take it into consideration that they are performing this very important task of socializing or worlding, let's say, the young reader into his or her surroundings, because we cannot forget that it is this young reader who will soon grow up into a full grown citizen ready to face the adult world, the grown up world, so to say. So I think it obviously it's very obvious that the writer feels that he or she has got an added responsibility to train up the young reader for such a world, so that the reader becomes armed with a specific worldview with which he or she can then confront the society. And it is in this consideration, it is in this respect that I request special attention to the nature of children, or the nature of readership uh, Satyajit Ray targeted in his stories, the intended readership, and how they were different from the kind of readers that his forefathers were targeting. The urban children Upendra Kishore wrote for still very much had their roots in the pre-modern rural society of Bengal. We'll have to keep in mind that though Sandesh was definitely, it was meant for a predominantly urban readership. I mean, the get-up of the magazine and the kind of pieces published in the magazine, it evidently shows that Sandesh is a product of the urban intellectual atmosphere, hugely influenced by the British, the colonial culture. Even Sandesh had a piece which uh, propounded King George as Amadeir Raja, but still, though it mainly targeted the urban children, uh, they were all a product of a pretty young urban culture, which still had its roots very much in a pre-modern rural society, which perhaps explains why Upendra Kishore wrote works based on epics and mythology like ছেলেদের রামায়ণ, ছেলেদের মহাভারত, পুরাণের গল্প, and মহাভারতের কথা, and also a collection of village folk tales named Tuntunir Boi. Besides, more modern works like A Walk on Natural History, like Shekaler Kotha. Shukumar's readership was decidedly more urban, since he was writing several years later, uh, and also more cosmopolitan, which perhaps explains why his satirical poems Abol Tabol and Khai Khai, they are predominantly about urban people, right? The localities, the people which they talk about, they mostly live in Calcutta, in the para culture prevalent in Calcutta during that time. Uh, they also talk a thing or two about the white town of Calcutta. Besides the black town where the natives live, it also talks a thing or two about the white town, because there is a poem which talks about Booth Saheber Bachata and all that. Uh, so satirical poem, predominantly urban, Abol Tabol and Khai Khai, and also school stories, which are decidedly a product of the Victorian culture of school stories like Tom Brown's School Days, school stories like Pagla Dashu, and pieces on Norse and Greek mythology, such as Devotar Durbuddhi, which talks about Thor and Hercules. On the other hand, the young adults whom Satyajit wrote for lived in a time which was decidedly different from Upendra Kishore or Shukumar's generation, because Sandesh actually closed down after Shukumar died. Shubinoy published the magazine for some years, and then it went into a hiatus. And by the time time Satyajit with his friend Subhash Mukhopadhyay was planning to revive the magazine again, uh, Bengal's society had undergone significant differences, and the young adult readership they were targeting this time through Sandesh, they lived in a society which was much more different. It was marked by increased social mobility and political turmoil. Moreover, there was an increased influence of American new imperial capitalism, because this was the post Second World War era when America's economic influence started spreading its wings on third world countries, let's say, more and more, with a consequent breakdown in the moral values of the Bhadralok class imbibed during the period of British imperialism. It is precisely this breakdown that Roy portrays in his Calcutta trilogy in the films Pratidwandi, Shimabadho, Jon Aronno. Significantly, this was also the period of vigorous demonstrations against the escalating role of the United States in the Vietnam War, which ultimately tore off the mask of US humanitarianism and grew into a broad social movement over the ensuing several years. This was also linked to the eventual rise in postmodern culture, a general distrust in state sponsored grand narratives, and emphasis on alternative narratives constructed from feminist, post colonial, or eco critical angles. We'll have to keep in mind that the mid 60s was also actually the period when the American view of life was getting challenged. American capitalism, American mercantile capitalism, the American way of seeing the world in a broader sense was facing significant challenges from various quarters. And there were student demonstrations in Paris, in US, uh, which gradually gave rise to the swinging 60s, and then the trend of seeing everything from an individualistic and alternative point of view. Uh, it's like disavowing the American version, disavowing the grand narrative version. That's what theory was all about, right? And this is when the flux of theory actually started. And it's all about alternative readings. Readings from the feminist point of view, readings from the post colonial point of view, readings from the eco critical point of view. Uh, my argument is that while Ray or Roy offers no clear alternative, while criticizing mercantile capitalism in his films, when we see his films, we often find there is a definite condemning of mercantile capitalism in his films. I mean, uh, and he's often pretty open about it. I mean, prior to the mid 60s and the end 60s, Rai often had to face this criticism from other people or other film enthusiasts, is that his films were not politically conscious enough. I mean, like people like Chidananda Dasgupta, with whom he established the Calcutta Cine Club, Calcutta Film Society. Chidananda said that Satyajit lives in a time when the society is passing through political turmoil and breakdown of traditional values, but we never see this upheaval in his films. However, when he started making films like Orone Din Ratri and Mahanagar, Pratidwandi, Shimabadho, that kind of allegations started diluting down, because they were pretty uh, contemporary, let's say. But what we often see in his films is that he offers no clear cut solution after the problem. He realizes that there is a definite problem, of course, especially, I mean, when we see that everything is becoming subject to money, economy, traditional values are getting broken down. In the hero of John Orono, for example, he gets no easy job, and he is introduced into the job of an order supplier, which involves a lot of unethical things, so to say, and he has a lot of unsavory experiences. The same questioning goes on in his later films as well, like Shaka Proshaka, Aguntuk. But there is no easy solution, right? However, He shows the problem, but he refuses to show any easy solution. However, there's another point also. He made it clear in several interviews his distrust in party-based communism. He always tended to say that I keep more faith on individual agency than on party-based ideologues. Uh, but what we shall see in course of this lecture is that he tries to carve out a definite alternative to this mercantile capitalism in his fiction for the young adult. So, though he is not offering any easy solution in his films, he perhaps is trying to carve out an alternative in his fiction. Probably because it offers a broader imaginative space, probably because young adult fiction helps him to create an alternative world. It helps him to create to extend his imaginative boundaries, let's say. And we know that as a rule, young adult fiction allows a broader scope of imagination. It helps in creating, it often takes recourse to creating fantasy worlds, alternative world views. There is great leaps from the mundane reality, and perhaps that is precisely the reason why it allows Satyajit to create an alternative world where he can then propagate his alternative worldview, symbols which can then serve as a vehicle for that alternative worldview, which we will see, which happens systematically in most of his young adult fiction. First of all, I'm going to talk about Feluda, which who is definitely the most well-known and talked about among Satyajit's literary creations. And what I have always thought about Feluda is that uh, when we when we talk about Feluda, he always comes across as someone who is a dedicated protector of the Vodrolok class, right? If you take a look at his clients, they are definitely, they hail from that Vodrolok class. People like, and they almost have uh, a pretty consistent physical appearance. They are always toke forsha or dhobdhobe forsha, and they are well built. They are in possession of a certain amount of uh, let's say cultural capital and economic capital. I can name a lot of characters in this mold. For example, there is of course uh, Mohesh Choudhury in Chinnamosar Obisha, Durga Goti Sen in Darjeeling Jomjomat, Birupakho Mojumdar in Hottapuri, then the lawyer in Bhushargo Bhayankar, uh, and the list goes on and on and on. And what we will see is that these people, they are always in possession of some valuable artifact. It might be a painting, as in Tintoretto Jishu. It might be a precious stone, as in Kailash Choudhury's Pathor. It might be a collection of stamps, like in Chinnamatar Obhishap. It might be the Balgopaler Murti in Ebarkando Kedarnathe. A valuable, a definite valuable artifact, which is some kind of a family heirloom, something that has been gotten uh, from generation to generation, and it has been there in their families, which by the way is a definite mark of their Bhadralok culture. And it's probably because Satyajit was writing for the young adults. He could not show the family life of these clients Most of the clients, they are either single or they are widowed. People like Kirtinarayan Acharya, people like Mohesh Chaudhuri, people like Kailash Chaudhuri, people like Durgagoti Sen, people like Birupakha Mojumdar. All of them, we will see that either their wives have died or they haven't married, or their wives are simply not mentioned. Yeah, there are female figures, of course, once or twice in the Feluda stories, but precisely because he was writing for young adults, we will find that most of these female figures are entirely desexualized. I mean, either they are small girl childs, like there is that Runa, the girl in Omboshen Ontodhan Rahasya, or then there is a Buri Pishima in Gosaipur Sorogoram. The only middle-aged woman who gets a kind of exposure in Satyajit Ray story is perhaps the woman in Chinnamas, the Feluda story is perhaps the Nilima Devi in Chinnamasar Abhishap, and there is a female character in Shokuntala Kontohar as well. But those are more exceptions. However, what these people, these Bhadraloks, these clients of Feluda, what they do have is that they have sons, or they have people who are like their own son, people who take that place of their son, like secretary's son, uh, and most of them, interestingly, we will find they share a problematic relationship with these father figures. I mean, we find that Durga Goti's son is he doesn't care about his father. Bijoy Mullik in Bhusorgo Bhayankar, he says clearly that বাবার সঙ্গে আমার খুব একটা বনে টনে না, বাবার সঙ্গে আমার খুব একটা কথাও হয় না. The same thing can be said about Jibanlal Mullik and his father Shamlal Mullik. Uh, and the list continues on and on and on. Mohesh Chaudhary has three sons, but the only son who perhaps understood him, Duri, he has run away, and neither the neither the eldest one nor the youngest Pritin can understand him properly and understand his values. More importantly, I mean, this is where the problem comes, because we always find that the next generation is not, I mean, the misunderstanding perhaps grows because the next generation is consistently not sympathetic about the worldview of these Bhadralok clients, because Satyajit makes it clear that the world has changed. All these Bhadralok clients, they believe, still they believe in that old world Bhadralok milieu, which is derived from, let's say, British imperialism. They have a semi-feudal mentality, and they always live in that kind of an ambience. They have most of them, they are filled with a retinue of a beara, and a cook, a driver, a secretary, I mean, a lot of people who serve them. They very much believe in that servant culture, people serving the Bhadralok owner. What the sons differ from is that they don't essentially believe in this kind of a worldview. They differ, often violently, and the problem arises because more often than not, the son, or the person who takes up the place of the son, does not really understand the sentiment attached with the valuable artifact, which is more often than not a family heirloom. It might be the Jahangir Swarna Mudra, it might be Kailash Chaudhury's Pathor, it might be the Bal Gopal, it might be the Tintoretto painting. All these artifacts, they are valuable to their owners, the Bhadralok clients, not only because they will fetch a lot of money, but also because they are a marker of their Bhadralok status. These are things which do not generally belong to ordinary people. These are things which do not generally belong to let's say middle class people like Feluda, because in Golok Dham also there is that moment when Feluda goes to the room of that the old the room of the old scientist, and then he goes to the room of Sukhwani, and he looks at valuable artifacts, and he tells Topse, যে পয়সা থাকলে at least ওই print গুলো কিনে ফেলতাম রে Topse, which is definitely a reminder that valuable things cannot really be afforded by the middle class, people like Feluda. So that's exactly why that valuable artifact for the Bhadralok, it might be the Puthi of Durgagoti, it might be the Balgopal in Kando Kedarnath, it might be the painting of Tintoretto in the Niyogi household. They are not only valuable to their original Bhadralok owners because they will fetch a lot of money, they are also valuable because they are a cultural status. They symbolize the special, the privileged Bhadralok status of the owner, and that is precisely the sentiment which their sons, or the people who serve as their son in the stories, uh, do not understand. They do not understand that the Napoleonic Chithi or the Balgopal is valuable precisely because of their prestige, the social prestige they hold. They only understand that these people are valuable because Satyajit makes it clear that the next generation, these sons and the secretaries and the sons of the secretaries, there is a son of the secretary that the guy, the Uma Shankar Puri, Nebarkando Kedarnath. Generally, it is the secretary who is the culprit in the Feluda stories, like Napoleon Chithi, like Golok Dham Rahasya. But in Ibarkando Kedarnath, it is actually the son of the secretary who is the villain. These people, these young people who belong to the next generation, Satyajit makes it clear that these people are very much grounded in the money economy, the mercantile capitalism of the present times, the mid 60s, the changing times. They understand nothing but money, and the only good thing which they see in these artifacts is not that these have been in their families for several generations and they are a marker of their Bhadralok class. They only understand this one reality, that these things will fetch a lot of money. And we always see that it is these sons or these next generation people like Bika Singh who are trying to sell off these family heirlooms, that Ganesh in Joy Baba Felunat. I can go on naming such artifacts. There is a whole list of these artifacts in the Feluda stories. That is precisely the reason why these sons or these young secretaries, they try to sell off these things by stealth and get some money, because they don't really understand the sentiment which is attached to these artifacts, the cultural prestige which is attached with these artifacts. They don't care about that. They only care about the money, and as a result, the middleman class is always present there. And significantly, it is always the middleman class who is shown in a worse light in the Feluda stories, who are direct agents of this mercantile capitalism. And who are this class of middlemen? The Marwari and the Sindhi businessmen. There are a lot of such characters in Feluda stories who are always ready to buy those artifacts once the next generation people bring them in. People with names like Pestanji, then there is Mr. Shomani in Tintoretto Jishu, then there is Hingorani, then there is Sukhwani, and all these people with Sindhi names, people who are businessmen, people who buy off these things and then sell them off to American collectors. There is always more often than not, there is an American collector behind all these happenings. The people who are giving money, who are spending money, a lot of money to get these things, and there is a middleman class, the Marwari class, and then there is those unsympathetic people, those the next generation, the young Bengalis, the sons or the secretaries or the son of the secretary who is trying to get those artifacts by force, because there is always that moment of misunderstanding between two generations in the Feluda story, where the son, he gets almost I mean, like the son he completely loses it and he shouts, like saying that baba বুঝছো না কেন এই জিনিসটা অনেক দাম, which by the way were treated as a taboo in the Bhadralok class, but we find that all those values have gradually broken down. These people are involved in gambling in search of some easy money, because money is all that they care for in this changed society. And in order to get some easy money, they are willing to sell off these artifacts. And those Marwari businessmen, they are more willing to buy them. And there is always an American, more often than not, there is an American at the end of the proceedings who is giving the money and who is taking, who is willing to buy those artifacts. And it is definitely significant that Mohanlal Meghraj, Feluda's arch nemesis, let's say, or arch rival, he is actually such a man, right? I mean, that's his. When we first see him in Joy Baba Feluna, that's what he deals in. He deals in these stolen artifacts. He procures them by hook or by crook, and then he sells them off to the best buyer. And significantly enough, it is this set pattern that the Feluda stories follow. We always find that the Bhadralok client, he is in a problem because he has found that his son or his secretary, the next generation who was supposed to be sympathetic to him, that person does not understand his sentiment, and that person is willing to sell off or steal his artifact by force if necessary. We At least we find one Feluda story where the son has used physical violence on his father, and that's in Gurgutiar Ghotona. Uh, and these people, these helpless Bhadraloks, because they are growing old, they come to Feluda to seek that help, to seek that sympathy, which was perhaps due from the son himself. And Feluda, it is precisely that role which he plays as a replacement for the son figure. He is that alternative son who understands their values, who sympathizes with them, and he always he calms them and he says that আপনি নিশ্চিন্তে থাকতে পারেন, আপনার এই মূল্যবান জিনিসটার মূল্য আমি বুঝি, আমার কাছে এটা সুরক্ষিত থাকবে. And he acts as a safekeeper of the artifact, or if the artifact gets stolen already, he procures them. He gets them from the hand of the middleman, uh, and then he takes it back to its original owner. That's basically his task, right, in most of the stories. And he is always, perhaps intentionally, uh, Satyajit, this was his way of condemning this money economy in this stories, I argue. He has always shown Feluda as the most merciless against these people, these these middlemen, the people who are the direct, let's say, representatives of this new mercantile capitalism. Because what is Bhadralok clients are also they are guilty of some crime, and that is one similarity of the Feluda story with the Holmes stories. Like the Holmes clients, these Bhadralok clients of Feluda also often have a guilty past. Uh, Birupakha Mojumdar had once accidentally killed a man. The old man in Bhushargo Bhayankar, he was a judge and he had mistakenly condemned an innocent man to capital punishment. And then there is Dr. Munshi, whose driver had unwittingly run his car upon a man. It's a hit and run case, and in all these cases, we will see that the son returns to seek revenge. In Dr. Munshi diary, it is the son who comes to seek revenge, disguised as a patient. There is the son who comes to seek revenge in Bhushargo Bhayankar as well. But strangely enough, all these crimes, they do not ultimately get that much punished or condemned in these Feluda stories. They are always kind of glossed over. And Feluda is pretty sympathetic to these old people. I mean, his attitude is always okay. Yeah, I mean, they have done a bad thing, unwittingly, perhaps unknowingly. Uh, so let bygones be bygones. He always tells those. That's his attitude. He tells those people, the people who have come to seek revenge, that why prolong this grudge? Ultimately, it was a mistake. However, he is the most merciless against those middlemen, the people who serve as representatives of that money economy. He is always most merciless against those people. People like Shomani, people like Hingorani, people like Mogonlal Meghraj. I mean, in Golapi Mukta Rahosyo, we see that Feluda is actually committing burglary in Meghraj's house. He takes some musclemen led by Motilal Boral and Feluda with those strong men. He burgles into Mogonlal's house to procure the Golapi Mukto. So that's perhaps significant. And besides this condemnation of these flag bearers of the new money economy, what Feluda also presents is a definite alternative to this mercantile capitalistic lifestyle. Because if we look at his personal lifestyle as well, he always believes in simple living and high thinking. He is somebody who does not hanker after money. In Jahangire Swarno Mudra, Topse makes it clear that he says that ফেলুদার একটা অদ্ভুত অভ্যাস আছে, গোটা ৩-৪টে কেসে যদি ওর ভালো রোজগার হয়, তারপরেই ও কেস ফেস ছেড়ে দিয়ে একটা নতুন কোনো নেশা নিয়ে ব্যস্ত হয়ে পড়ে, এবং সেই নেশা থেকে ওর কিন্তু রোজগারের কোনো আশা থাকে না। And then in Darjeeling Jomjomart again, Topse says that আমি বুঝেছি যে ফেলুদা খরুচে লোক, ও টাকা জমানোর থেকে খরচ করার নেশাটা বেশি. So he does not really hanker for money, and we often see that he is there are instances where he solves a case almost without any money, where there is no possibility of any economic gain. For example, take for example the case in Gorostane Shabdan. I mean, his client is actually a dead white man, right? Charles Godwin. And Feluda is definitely not getting paid in this case, but still he pursues the case and ultimately solves it. And that is precisely also why his role model maybe is Shidhu Jata, because Shidhu Jata is also somebody who does not believe in this kind of capitalistic society. I mean, in Golapi Mukta Rahosyo, he makes it so clear to Feluda that চাইলে আমি অনেক চাকরি করতে পারতাম, কিন্তু আমি চাকরি করিনি, কেননা চাকরি করলেই তো সেখানে একটা ধরা বাঁধা জীবনে বাধা পড়তে হবে। আমি আমার চোখ কান খুলে থাকি, এবং আমার জীবনটা যদি আমার নিজের মর্জিতে কাটাতে না পারলাম, তাহলে আর কি হলো? সেই জন্য আমি কোনো কিছুই করলাম না। মানে which also in an individual level it serves as let's say a resistance to the capitalistic thinking, the capitalistic worldview. And Satyajit in his interviews, by the way, he always made this thing clear that I do not believe in party ideologues. I do not subscribe to this mentality that it is a party which will always offer an alternative to the prevalent social setup. But I always keep my faith in individual agency, and that's precisely what we get to see in his young adult fiction. Feluda is an individual whose lifestyle is offering a definite let's say alternative to the capitalistic lifestyle, the mercantile capitalist worldview. Shidhu Jata is another such individual, and of course Professor Shonku is another such individual, because Shonku has been presented as an idealistic figure. He is completely above greed. He is above ruthless competition. We have seen him in a lot of stories. We have seen him being tempted by people Uh, I mean, people are saying that you will get a lot of money in Professor Shonku or Robu. Borgelt tempts him, saying that I will give you a lot of money. I will give you uh, golden guilds, and you sell me your robot. And then there is, of course, Luigi Dondi, who also offers Shonku money. And when Shonku definitely does not take the money, and he keeps on saying that লোভ আমি অনেকদিন আগে জয় করেছি, টাকার লোভ আমাকে দেখিয়ে কোনো লাভ হবে না. He is definitely above greed, and he is definitely above ruthless competition, another product of this mercantile capitalistic society, where people are ready to do anything to gain more money, more status. He really does not care about I mean, this guy is making more progress in scientific work. I mean, in Professor Rondi Time Machine, we see that there are three men who were working at the same time on the same concept of the time machine. There is Professor Kleiber, there is Professor Trilokesha Shonku in India, and there is Professor Luigi Rondi in Italy. It's ultimately Rondi who beats Shonku, and Shonku does not hold any grudge against him. Never in the story do we get any implication that he is angry that Rondi has beat him to the race. He is very helpful towards Rondi. He, in fact, helps to better Rondi's machine. Uh, so he's definitely above competition. He's definitely above jealousy, and uh, he also refuses on taking patents on a lot of he also refuses to market a lot of his discoveries. I mean, that's also something pretty significant, because he says that a lot of my discoveries are not suitable to market economy, because they cannot be manufactured anywhere other than my own laboratory. So that also perhaps serves a veritable alternative to this the market economy, the mercantile capitalistic worldview, refusing to market your product. Uh, and precisely in order to highlight this kind of an exceptionalism in Shonku's character, we find that he is repeatedly pitted against scientists who serve as his foil. Scientists who are greedy, who are merciless, who are jealous, who can be ruthless in their spirit of competition. People like Luigi Rondi in Professor Rondi Time Machine, people like Anton Shering in Dr. Shering and Sharon Shokti. He was willing to sell off his formula of atomic weapon to anyone who will pay him a better sum. People like Cornelius Humboldt, who tries to take the credit of creating a live organism from Shonku in the story Astro Joprani. Then people like Karl Gropius, who tries to ruin Shonku's reputation in Shonku Shonit Dosha because he was jealous of Shonku. People like Rodolfo Carboni, another person who is jealous of Shonku in Professor Shonku Eurofo. People like Professor Schulz, who has murdered people in Shonku Porlok Chorcha. People like Rufus Blackmore in Shonku Suborno Sujog. And we also find people who are power mad, people uh, who have become ruthless in their search for power, in their search for agency. People like James Massingham in Professor Shonku Gorilla, people like Alexander Krag in Hypnogen. And very often in Shonku stories, we find a parable on limitless consumerism. I mean, for example, a story like Manro Deeper Rohosho. I mean, it can be read as a parable on limitless consumerism, right? When Hector Manro in his diary writes that আমি দেখলাম এই আশ্চর্য নীল ফল খেয়ে মানে এদের এই জলদস্যুদের ক্ষুধা ক্রমশ বৃদ্ধি পাচ্ছে এবং একমাত্র অপঘাত অথবা অনাহার ছাড়া এদের আর মৃত্যু নেই এবং and then the final lines which he writes in his diary, it's a question, a very valid question. It's a question where he asks, কিন্তু এই যে অপরিমিত ক্ষুধা যা কখনো শেষ হয় না, এ কি মানুষের পক্ষে সত্যি মঙ্গলজনক? It's definitely a parable on limitless consumerism. And that short story of Shonku, that short story of Satyajit, that Septopased Khide, it also can serve as a parable on limitless consumerism, because the tree, that Septopas, its hunger also keeps on increasing, right? At first it keeps devouring rats and such, and then it keeps on devouring cats, and then it devours Batsha, it kills Batsha, Mastiff, Hound, and then it attacks a human being. So its hunger, it's insatiable. It is the same parable on limitless consumerism that becomes an eventual product of mercantile capitalism. Uh, and also, yeah, there is an American millionaire in Hottapuri, and there are numerous unethical American millionaires and scientists in Shonku. I mean, precisely because Shonku is more international in its scope, it enabled Satyajit to bring in a lot of bad American characters than Feluda, of course. And I mean, we will always find that Satyajit is consistently he is condemning towards these American millionaires. He is consistently bringing up these characters in Shonku stories almost as a routine. There is Gideon Morgenstern in Mohakashe Dut. There is Solomon Bloomgarten in Nokur Babu El Dorado. They are all millionaires and unethical. There is Hiram Horenstein in Dr. Sheninge Shonon Shokti. There is the American scientist Goldstein in Baghdad, Professor Shongo Baghdad Baksho. There is Wingfield in Kompu. Uh, and there is, of course, that guy, that Argus the magician in Corvus. He's not an American, but he's a millionaire nevertheless, and he tries to buy off Corvus. And then also there is an American millionaire in the short story Maharaja Tarini Kuro, right? He's also named Horenstein. And then, of course, Satyajit's short stories. There is that short story Oshomanjo Babur Kukur, where Oshomanjo Babu gets that magical dog, the brownie, who laughs. And then we find that it is also a story against mercantile capitalism, because ultimately there is an American buyer who comes to buy Oshomanjo Babur Kukur, and then Oshomanjo Babu ultimately gets offered a lot of money, but he refuses to sell off Brownie. And then when Brownie laughs at the end of the story, when the Bengali middleman, he asks Oshomanjo Babu, Brownie hasche keno? Oshomanjo Babu says that Brownie hasche কারণ মানে ওর এটা দেখে মজা লাগছে যে আপনারা ভাবছেন যে পয়সা দিয়ে সমস্ত কিছু কিনে নেওয়া যায়, and then the middleman, of course, he gets very angry, and then he says that বটে আপনার কুকুর কি দার্শনিক নাকি মশাই? And then, of course, there is McKenzie Fruit, which personally I think it is Satyajit's greatest resistance or greatest condemnation of mercantile capitalism. The story of McKenzie Fruit itself, I mean, it speaks volumes. Nishikanto Babu, he discovers a magical fruit with special qualities, a fruit which can take off or which can cure all diseases, like something like Miracural in Shonku, and he finds it in the garden house of Mackenzie, a former a British who used to formerly reside in India. And significantly, Nishikanto Babu, who actually discovers the fruit, he does not, I mean, he does not name the fruit as Nishikanto fall or something like that. He names it as Mackenzie Fruit. And that maybe talks about that colonial mentality. I mean, Radhanachik that discovered the highest peak, but the peak got named after his boss, right? George Everest, Mount Everest. So the fruit gets named as Mackenzie Fruit, though it is discovered by a Bengali. But then Nishikanto, who represents that, much like Professor Shonku, Nishikanto also represents that the non-interested man in quest for knowledge, because Nishikanto is also a schoolmaster, so he comes from that class very much. He discovers the fruit, and he writes an article on the fruit, and gradually the fruit gets noticed by, well, Indian businessmen, and they come and they set up a full-fledged industry where they can the fruit and sell it outside. And Satyajit makes it clear that Nishikanto Babu had thought that this fruit can be distributed among poor people in order to cure their diseases, but poor people are not actually getting it anyway, because the fruit is very expensive once it gets scanned, and it gets scanned away to people who can afford to buy them, Europeans and Americans. And ultimately, uh, Nishikanto Babu himself, surprisingly, one day is barred from entering the garden. And then he says in his faulty Hindi, "আমি নিশিকান্ত হ্যাঁ, আমি এই ফল আবিষ্কার কিয়া হ্যাঁ, তো हमें ঢুকনে दो." And but he gets kicked out because after all he's just a commoner, right? So uh, I don't know. I mean, I find an uncanny similarity to the plot of the story with the way Satyajit's concept of the film Alien got stolen. He wrote it, and then that guy, that Mark Wilson, he told Satyajit that a Hollywood film can be made on it. The story is very well known, and Satyajit went and spent several weeks in Hollywood in that hope. Mark Wilson told him that I will make you meet Marlon Brando, Steve McQueen, but ultimately nothing happened. Wilson took a copyright on the script without Satyajit's knowledge, and then finally, when Satyajit came back, that idea went down the drains. And when he saw Spielberg making E.T., he straight away accused Spielberg of plagiarizing his concept. So somewhere the story, I mean, it's very similar to McKenzie Fruit's plot, right? The credit gets stolen by somebody else. Uh, and there are unethical rich people in a general sense. They are, I mean, a lot of unethical rich people are there in Shotoji's stories. People who only hanker about money, and they are not really good people. I mean, stories like Lakpoti, and then Class Friend, then Mr. Shashmal Shesh Ratri, Mr. Shashmal who has murdered his colleague Bijoy for and then there is Chile Kotha. I mean, those stories. And then there is another thing which we find in Shotoji's stories, that is urban paranoia. I mean, this modern city mentality, he makes it clear in some stories that it is ultimately making us paranoid. This, I mean, in a somewhat broader sense, we can also see this as a questioning of mercantile capitalism, let's say, because it is this capitalistic world, this capitalistic society, which ultimately makes us paranoid in the urban space, right? Uh, I mean, the stories like Sadhon Babu's Sandeho, where he drops off that box containing the watch. By fearing it as a severed head sent by a criminal. And then, of course, Otiti, the short story from where Aguntuk eventually got made. The when the relative arrives, these people are so much apprehensive. They simply cannot trust him, because it is this capitalistic society where they can no longer trust a person. And when in Aguntuk, Monomohan Mitra tells his niece that আমি বিশ্বাস করি তোমরা এখনো সেই আগেকার ভারতবর্ষের যে অতিথি নারায়ণের যে কনসেপ্ট সেটা ভুলো নাই, but actually they have forgotten it, right? Those values have broken down, and people no longer trust each other. So a definite sense of paranoia. Then, of course, in another way, an alternative can be seen in the message of non-violence. Satyajit is decidedly anti-violent in his young adult fiction, except perhaps in Feluda, where he had to bring in some physical action, since it was ultimately a detective story genre. Otherwise, we consistently see him going against war, a war which ultimately war again, which also gets which ultimately results from capitalistic interests, right? Both the world wars and then all the other wars which the US have fought, they have ultimately been results of capitalistic interests. And Satyajit is decidedly anti-war. He is anti-war in Gupi Gain Bakabain, he is anti-war in Hirok Rajar Deshe. And of course, I will argue that Gupi and Bagha, they play a crucial role in Satyajit's stories. Guppy and Bagha, they play American superheroes because Guppy Bagha are definitely superheroes, right? But they present a definite alternative to the idea of American superheroes who use violence as a solution. They are superheroes, there is no question about that, but they simply do not use violence. We see Superman, Batman, and all those American superheroes using their fists as an easy solution, right? And Satyajit mentions in passing some American superheroes in his stories. Uh, European superheroes, American superheroes, people like Orono Deb, Phantom, people like Superman. Those were comic strips which people in his world were already reading. But Guppy and Bagha are definite alternatives because they do not use violence. And again, Professor Shonku is a person who cannot stand bleeding. That is why he uses that gun annihilin, which does not result in bleeding, but simply makes the victim disappear. Uh, and then the irrational. Time and again, we find in Satyajit's stories that he presents an alternative or he challenges the aggressive rationalism propounded by the mercantile capitalist worldview, because it is this US based worldview, this Eurocentric worldview, which insists on seeing everything as rational, right? It is an almost aggressive rationalism, which repeatedly gets undermined in Satyajit's stories. Uh, More often than not in the stories of Professor Shonku itself. He being a scientist, we find that pretty early in his stories, we find that he believes in ghosts. Shonku's forefather was a tantric, Botukeshwar Shonku, and in Professor Shonku Bhoot, he witnesses the ghost of his forefather. Shonku has written a book on the scientific foundation of ghosts. We come to know from Professor Shonku Egyptio Atonko. And again and again, his pride in rationality, Shonku's faith in rationality is thwarted by the irrational. In stories like Professor Shonku Har, Professor Shonku Bhoot, Professor Shonku Egyptio Atonko, Shopnodip, then Moru Rohosho, where a Bede Buri predicts Demetrius's date and time of death. Then Don Cristobaldi's Bhovishot Bani, where the fortune the Don Cristobaldi, his all his predictions they come true, and of course Axringo Vijan, where there is a whole place called Dunglung Do, where fantastic creatures thrive, and of course the character of Nokur Babu, who himself is a standing, let's say, a standing challenge to everything rational, and I mean. Satyajit himself says in a lot of interviews that I actually believe in the paranormal, and I believe that science still does not understand this field. One day, maybe science will become advanced enough or will extend its boundaries to bring them into its scope. And then there are a lot of stories where Shonku's European scientific prowess is simply not enough to understand what is happening. For example, a story like Professor Shonku Khoka, where the Khoka gets his magical power suddenly, and then he consumes annihilin acid, and then he goes back to his former self. Then also a creature like Ashur Jontu, then the plant which Shaunoporni, which ultimately results in miracural, and then again Oriental science challenging, I mean, a definite this can definitely be treated as something post-colonial, where he is challenging the Eurocentric worldview that science it is America and Europe who stands at the center of the scientific activities of this world, where we see that Oriental science is doing something which is humbling the Western scientists. For example, a story like Professor Shonko Bagdader Baksho, then Nefrudete Samadhi, where the formula to to artificially prepared diamond is given. The Shonkur Suborno Sujog, again, where even alchemy is shown to be ultimately useful and not a pseudoscience as dismissed away by Western scientists. Then there are irrational in a number of Tarinuguru stories as well, ghosts and other beings who serve as a kind of challenge to the dominant worldview propounded by, let's say, the American society, the the society which is born out of mercantile capitalism, the Western society. Uh, Ghosts appear in a number of Tarini Kuro stories like Maharaja Tarini Kuro, Dumni Goren Manushkeko, Khalwat Tarini Kuro, of course, has that Ronjir Bhoot, Lucknow Duel, Tarini Kuro, Betal, and then, of course, his ghost, his short stories. ফ্রিজ, নীল আতঙ্ক, রামধনের বাঁশি, আমি ভূত, ব্রাউন সাহেবের বাড়ি, খগম, মিস্টার শাসমলের শেষ রাত্রি, অনাথবাবুর ভয়, অভিরাম, ভূত, নরিশ সাহেবের বাংলো. A lot of stories where the ghost actually comes. And there is also a certain touch of irrationality in a Feluda story as well. Sonar Kella, the thing about Jatishwar, it is definitely something which traditional, at least during those times, it was unexplainable. And then a few things about the holy men in Ray's story. Uh, there are a lot of holy men, so-called holy men in Ray's fiction, but those holy men, we will see that they are, again, they are generally good. They are shown to know their art. They are genuine when they don't charge money for their art or for their tasks. And again, here, I mean, we see a direct condemnation of the money economy, the capitalistic outlook. For example, in Professor Shonku Har, in Khogom, those holy men, they really know their task. They are genuine people. They are not frauds. And none of them are seen to charge money for what they are doing. Uh, and then again, they are shown to be bad when they actually charge money and they enjoy the fruits of capitalistic economy. Those holy men are shown to be bad. For example, the holy man in Nitai or Mahapurush, who is ultimately revealed to be a classmate of Nitai, Cheno. Then, of course, uh, a lot of Feluda stories show them. Joy Baba Feluna, there is that fraud Mochli Baba, Gosaipu Sorogorom, the man who performs planchet, a semi holy man, the Mriganko Bhattacharya, Attaram Babu. Then in Hottapuri, the guy, that Lokhon Bhattacharya. There is also someone in Gangtok Gondogol, a person who is ultimately revealed to be a disguise of Shoshodhar Babu. The person did not exist. Uh, so those people, holy men in Satyajit's stories, they are revealed to be frauds. Holy men or people who are said to be in possession of paranormal powers, they are revealed to be fraud more often than not when they are charging money. So again, a certain condemnation of this capitalistic outlook. And then also, uh, this might be treated as an alternative to the US worldview at large, not so much maybe an alternative to mercantile capitalism, not directly so at least, but definitely an alternative to the US worldview. The dominant worldview during that period, which is going beyond identities and friendship beyond categorized identities, which we get to see in various forms in a lot of race stories. For example, there are those post-colonial there are those friendships in Feluda where we see relations between uh, representatives of the ruling class and the ruled, which goes beyond the relation of the ruler and the ruled. For example, Parvati Charan marrying that British woman in Birendra Shelvankar marrying a German woman, Helmut's mother Helga, in Gangtok Gondogol. Then another such marriage takes place in Shokuntalar Kontohar as well. Uh, and then in Professor Shonku, we also see this tendency to go beyond established identities, where we see Professor Shonku having at least two British friends who are seen to be very helpful, Jeremy Saunders and John Somerville. And then also there is Archibald Ackroyd in the stories in the beginning. In a couple of stories he features. And Saunders is again friends with a German, Kroll. So Saunders is a British, Kroll is a German, and Shonku is an Indian. And they are friends in a post Second World War society. So that rings a bell, right? A British and a German being best friends and both befriending a man from a third world country, India, Trilokeshwar Shonku. And then again, there are friendship with other life forms. For example, in the short stories, we see Shodananদের Khude Jagat, where he is befriending ants. Brown Sahibের বাড়ি, there is that cat. অসমঞ্জ বাবুর কুকুর, there is Brownie the dog and অসমঞ্জ বাবু. বৃহৎ চঞ্চু, which recently got made into a film, where that the bird forms a friendship with Tulsi Babu. Then Sujon Horbola, the fairy tale like story of Satyajit Ray, where Sujon is a ventriloquist and he forms friendship with uh, a lot of animals. And then again, there are such friendships in Professor Shonku as well, friendship with animals. There is, of course, Newton. There is the macaw in Professor Shonku of Macau. There is a crow in Corvus. There is Dhimu the slow loris in Swapnodip. There is EA or the extraordinary animal in Ashur Jontu. And there is Saunders cat Mustafa in Shonkur Suborno Sujok. Even in Feluda, we see one such friendship. The friendship between Karandikar and Sultan the Tiger, right, in Chinnamasta Rovisha. And in Shonar Kella, significantly, it is a man who doesn't like peacocks who is the villain. Uh, and then friendship with extraterrestrial beings. The most, let's say, daringly imaginative friendship. Uh, and that is in exact opposition to Hollywood films during those period. Ray was imagining friendship with extraterrestrial beings in a time when Hollywood had been churning out one film after another, where the aliens are presented as violent, they are presented as harmful, which directly takes its influence from works like War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. Films like Encounters of the Third Kind were being made. Ray's aliens rise aliens in direct opposition to that tradition of treating the other as aggressive. They are sympathetic, they are helpful, they often help and get helped by humans. For example, in short stories, there are a lot of examples like this. In Satyajit Ray's first story, Bonku Babu's Bondhu, we see Yang, who is helping Bonku Babu. In Onko Sar Golapi Babu or Tipu, Golapi Babu helps Tipu. Then in Professor Shonku, in Mohakashe Dut, there are those aliens who have consistently helped human civilization. In Professor Shonku UFO, significantly, it is not the alien who uses the UFO to destroy historical monuments. The alien probably had benevolent plans. It is actually Carboni Rodolfo Carboni who gets mad and uses the UFO for destructive purposes. In Professor Shonku Roktomotso Rohosho, we see Shonku, Hamakura, Tanaka, they are actually helping the alien fish to escape. In Don Cristobaldi, Bhobishot Bani, we see the extraterrestrial beings, they are actually helpful and they are non-violent. And in Bomjatri Diary, in the first Shonku story itself, we see that the aliens of Tafa, they actually save Shonku, Bidushekar, Prahlad, and Newton by bringing them to their own to their own planet. I mean, what I intend to say is that through all this, we can see that there is a definite alternative which Shotojit tries to carve out, which is an alternative version to the dominant uh, discourse during that period, the discourse propounded by mercantile capitalism, which in turn takes its roots from US economy and in a broader sense a definite US worldview of seeing things, Eurocentric, aggressively rational, believing in the supremacy of the white identity and seeing the other as a threat. All these things they get related to that worldview. So we can say that Shotojit consistently tries to carve out a definite alternative to such kind of a worldview in his fiction for the young adult. Uh, though he probably he does not really does that in his films which talk about the breakdown of old world values and the aggressive encroachment of mercantile capitalism, though there he does not really seem to show an easy solution. He definitely tries to offer an alternative worldview in his young adult fiction, again probably because it offers a broader imaginative space. Being fiction for the young adults, it definitely enables him to construct alternative worlds, to take resort to allegories, to show, for example, the other as aliens in coming to this world. Uh, he could show that because he was writing science fantasy, which definitely goes beyond realism. So it is because his stories offer him a scope of the paranormal, the fantastic, that he could build those alternative worlds where maybe an Ang comes and harbors his spaceship in Basbagan. Uh, so that was maybe the reason why he was trying to offer this alternative worldview in his young adult fiction. And I will end this lecture by mentioning a film of Ray, which is two, where which perhaps uh, which has a lot of similarities with the young adult fiction which he wrote. They had the film Two has two children as its center, and it is actually a parable on mercantile capitalism, consumerist capitalism, right? The guy, the kid inside the house, he has a lot of playthings, whereas the kid outside has almost nothing, primitive playthings. But at the end of the film, it becomes obvious that machines and artificial playthings cannot really give you happiness. It is the poor boy outside who is actually free, who has a whole sky to enjoy, while the boy, he may have many playthings, but he is ultimately trapped in that house, and he can only see the poor boy playing around in the wide field. He can never participate in his joy. So that's it. I hope I have made at least some sense. Uh, Thank you, people, for bearing with me for so long.
Thank you, Viproda. Thank you for this amazing lecture. It was very nice to hear from you. Pratim,
Thank
if
you.
you want to comment something, or yes, and then maybe we can move to the Q&A session. This was amazing. Like you presented like so many of his works and so many views. It's really amazing listening to you. There are many questions
Thank you.
that we like. There are many questions in the YouTube chat box. Biproda, if you want, then we can proceed with the Q&A session. We can take the
Yeah,
questions from the
definitely.
YouTube chat box.
Sure,
Thank you so
sure.
much. Okay, the first question is from Debanjan Metro. Uh, Bipro, do you think that Roy wants to age a crisis of values in his fictions? I mean, the age in which he resided was an age of upheaval where this culture crisis became the most prominent.
Yeah, I mean, definitely so, Devanjana. I mean, that is what I was talking about, right? I mean, Satyajit was writing at a time when there was definitely a breakdown of old world values. That those values which got imbibed from the British by the Bhadralok class, and we definitely see a breakdown of such values. I mean, that's what a lot of the Feluda stories are about. It is those values which are getting broken down. In the world where the young generation live in, a lot of things which were considered taboo during uh, the time of the Bhadraloks, they are being done, they are being indulged in by their descendants. For example, gambling, which was definitely a taboo in for the Bhadraloks, and that is exactly why they don't understand that sentiment attached to those artifacts. Those artifacts kept by their forefathers, and they try to sell them off. So definitely a breakdown of values, crisis of values, and Satyajit is trying to bring them to the forefront in his young adult fiction as well. We know that, I mean, it's a known truth. It's almost hypothetical that he tried to show them through his films. A lot of films, most of his films deal with them, except maybe the period pieces which he made on the stories of Robindranath and such. The Calcutta trilogy deals with that, those things. The Shaka Proshaka deals with that, where the father is so sad because his sons do not really abide by the rules which he uh, is fond of. Work is worship. Honesty is the best policy, as he keeps on saying, and it is the same that same thing which gets portrayed in his stories as well. Yeah, definitely. In Shonku also, that is what is being shown, right? I mean, a scientist is supposed to be. He's supposed to be benevolent. He's supposed to be above corruption. He's supposed to be above competition. He's supposed to be above petty jealousy. He's not supposed to sell himself for a temptation of money. But that's precisely what Shonku's antagonists are not. They are scientists, but they often fall prey to jealousy and the competitive spirit of the age, and they often sell off themselves to the best buyer. So yeah, that's definitely the case.
Thank you so much. Yes, the next question is from Aditya Banerjee. In Joy Baba Feluna, the son didn't want to sell the murti of Ganesh, but Bikash Singh did it only. Well, on the other hand, we see that the kid, that is Captain Spark, was comfortable with his grandpa and interested in knowing mythologies too. Don't you think, Bipro, that the character itself, Shonku, has a resemblance? And I think there's another part to this question. Has a resemblance with the ancient sages of our country, like a simple living, high thinking. Shonku used to say that he made things in cheap rate.
Yeah,
Once
both
he
of
was, yeah.
okay.
No, you can continue. There's another part, I think. Yes.
Yeah, but I have read it, so yeah, it's okay. Yeah, those are very good questions, Aditya. I mean, very good question. But to come to the first part, yeah, it's not the son, Umanath, who wanted to sell the Ganesh, because yeah, it's not that it's always the son. That's something which I mentioned in my lecture. It's not always the son who wants to sell the artifact off. It's often the secretary, the young secretary. For example, Shuprakash is the secretary in Golokdam Rahasya. Uh, and then there is also that the bad secretary in Napoleon Chitti. It's not a son, so and it is the son of the secretary in Evarkando Kedarnath. It's not the son. It's not always the son who is the villain, but rather a figure who belongs to the next generation. I mean, we talk about father figures. This might be treated as a son figure who is supposed to be a natural descendant to the old world values of the Bhadralok client, but who is not. I mean, who is willing to sell off those artifacts, who does not understand those sentiments, and who eventually performs the crime. It's not always the son, but also someone who maybe can take the place of the son, because as I mentioned, more often than not, I mean, in several cases, Feluda's clients, they do not have well established families. So it is rather the secretary who serves as his son, a son figure, someone who helps him in his tasks. A secretary like Shukhomoy in Dr. Munshi Diary, a secretary like Shu Prakash in Golok Dham Rahasya, and it is this secretary who ultimately turns out to be the criminal. So it's not so much the son, but rather a representative of the young generation, let's say, who does not really have any patience or sympathy for the values and sentiments of the older generation. Shonku definitely has a resemblance with the old priests, definitely so, because I mean, hell, his characters, the paintings suggests it enough, right? The illustration, he looks like a sage, and it's also that it is something which I would like to mention. Shonku's stories have undergone a definite increase in seriousness as we go on, because as Satyajit himself says in a certain interview, which is pretty evident from the tone of the first Shonku story. Shonku was first planned as a semi-parody. He took the influence from his father's writings, that Heshoram Hushiare diary, and when we see that first Shonku illustrations in Bomjapchi diary, there is definitely a touch of comic in the first Shonku story. I mean, the Shonku inventions, they are borderline ridiculous. I mean, Noshasro and Jimbonasro, which makes you yawn. I mean, those are definitely comic. And then when Shonku comes and sees his own reflection in the mirror, and he says that হঠাৎ করে একটা লোকের চেহারা থেকে আঁতকে চেঁচিয়ে উঠলাম, তারপর দেখলাম ও না, এটা তো আমারই চেহারা, কতদিন ধরে দাড়ি কাটা হয় না. And then when we see the illustration of Shonku, it is definitely, he looks like a madman. There is a touch of the insane in his portrayal, but it is this Shonku whose illustration then gradually goes through a process of increasing, let's say, this sagifying, because then we come to that collection, the Professor Shonkur Kando Karkhana, where he still bears that resemblance with that unkempt hair and all. But then when we come to the later collections, Selam Professor Shonku and Shoyong Professor Shonku, it is there that we come to see Shonku. I mean, he's such a serious man. His beard is impeccably shaved, impeccably maintained, let's say. Those wild tufts of hair in his bald head has completely gone. It's a neat bald head. It almost seems to reflect light. It is so perfectly bald. And his dress, it is so perfect. He's so perfectly and impeccably dressed. And it is this illustration which Abhijit Chattopadhyay actually follows in his comics, right? He does not show the mad Shonku. He shows this Shonku, this sage-like figure who is impeccable, who is so perfect, who is above temptation, who holds his cool. I mean, the first Shonku was not so cool. That's very obvious that Shonku was still in his, let's say, construction mode. The first Shonku was pretty vindictive, because Prahlad, because he's angry with Prahlad, he tries to teach him a lesson, and he applies that Noshastra on Prahlad. He's pretty vindictive. The later Shonku is above those petty mood issues and tantrums. He is the perfect sage. He is the man who is again, as I was saying, above jealousy, above cruelty, above temptation. And yeah, Shornoporni, we see the reign of Hitler. Shonku discovered it from jungle, and I think nature is a trope Rai used many times in his fictions. Yeah, definitely so, because uh, uh, I mean, consistently we see there is a call back to nature, where nature, again, nature is presented as a definite alternative to this. Uh, there is also a certain touch of nostalgia here. He is getting influenced by the the let's say the pre-modern nostalgia about non-urban spaces, as spaces infested by jungle, which offers you a kind of escape. That is a trope which he definitely uses in his a lot of his young adult fiction. I mean, we see Shonku going to places where I mean, again, Manodipe Rahosyo. Manodipe Rahosyo is also, it is also a parable which talks about paradise lost. Everything was going on so perfectly in Manrodip, unless and until Black Hole Brandon and his compatriots, I mean men, so to say, they set their foot on the island, and almost everything started to go wrong from there. There are no living animals. The forest in Mandodipe Rahasya, Shonku keeps on writing that the forest is strange in its perfect silence. Why is it silent? Because all those living organisms, they have been eaten up by Black Hole Brandon, who is a symbol of, let's say, ruthless and unbridled consumerism. He literally consumes anything and everything. He consumes all the birds, he consumes the monkeys, he consumes the rats on the island, and finally he ends up consuming a human, the Bill Kallenbach, the scientists. Yeah, there is definitely a touch of the non-urban space, jungle as a release. I mean, that's what happens in Chinno Wasaro Bishop also, right? When they go to picnic in Rajarappa, it's definitely a release from the urban space. That happens in Royal Bengal Rohosho as well. But that happens in Professor Shonku Africa, Shonku Congo Bijan. Everywhere there is that touch of freedom associated with the jungle. That happens in Brihot Chonju as well. Dondo Karanno is actually the place where Tulsi Babu can indulge in his hobbies. It offers him a definite release from the claustrophobic urban space that is Calcutta. And when we come to the films, well, that is actually what Aranya Dinratri is all about. The forest is a more noble place. The forest is, and man, like Manrodipe Rohosho, in Aranya Dinratri, man comes, and it is those urban men, Soumitra, Somit, Bhanjo, Robi Ghosh, and Shubhendu, who come and corrupt the forest. They enter into a liaison with Simi Garwal, that the tribal girl, and it's definitely a crime. It is an exploitation, and Somit Bhanjo gets a kind of retribution for that. So that tone is very much present. That the urban people are coming and they are polluting the non-urban space, so to say. And very interestingly, in the monster movies made in the recent years, I see an exact echo of that philosophy preached by Ray. Because when you see the movie Kong Skull Island, exactly that thing gets that happens. In Kong Skull Island, we'll see the scientists, when they return from Skull Island, they are talking among themselves and they are saying that maybe we should keep Skull Island a secret from civilized people, because it is a paradise which should be left untouched, uncorrupted by man. And that actually happens ultimately. I mean, and then in a film got made by David Yates, The Legend of Tarzan, where it is the same tone of the forest getting corrupted by civilized men and then getting, of course, liberated by Tarzan. So, yeah, definitely this trope is present in Ray's writings repeatedly and in his films as well. But yeah, there's another thing I would like to add. In Shaka Proshaka, there is that moment when these urban people, when they go for a picnic, and that Soham Horlicks Chakraborty, he says Mungari, and when it's only when they go to Mungari when Mamata Sonko starts singing. and that's pretty symbolic because Lily Chakraborty says তোকে তো আগে কখনো গাইতে শুনিনি. Singing, the spontaneous expression of the self, only becomes possible when you go away from a claustrophobic urban space and you go to the forest surrounding of Mungari. And it is also there where Ranjit Mollik also breaks his silence, right? He and all his let's say his resistance, words of resistance come out, and he says like baba ekta legend, তোমরা বাবার নখের যোগ্য হতে পারবে না. That resistance ultimately comes when he goes to the forest, and Dipankar says chipita khol. His chipi ultimately gets opened not in an urban space, but ultimately when he's taken away from that urban space, it is there where he becomes more spontaneous, let's say. So yeah, definitely the jungle is a dominant trope.
Thank you. And the next question is from Arun. I'm sure violence is part of the detective stories without propagating violence for violence sake. Are his works
Yeah,
challenging the capitalist
that's actually
rationalism?
a
To what extent they are
very good
protecting
question.
control? Because there is another
Because
question. Yeah.
hmm, huh. uh, as to the first
हाँ ठीक
part
है
of the
तुम बोलो.
question, the violence for violence, it definitely does not Feluda stories definitely does not propagate violence for violence, because uh, there are two moments from Feluda stories which I would like to mention. One is from London Feluda, where we see such kind of an eye for an eye thing when Ranjan Majumdar killed Peter Dexter, and then he ultimately gets killed because Peter Dexter hurled racial abuses towards Indians, towards Ranjan Majumdar, and he in Cam River they were boating together, and he killed him. And it's then when after all these years we see that Peter's brother, he was working in Darjeeling in a tea estate. He finds Ranjan Majumdar, comes to his house, and shoots him dead. So there's a definite message in the story that an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. Revenge does not pay. That kind of thing. Violence only begets violence, and that's not actually good. And there is also another very significant scene because that's very significant because Feluda himself participates in that scene. It's there in Robertson Ruby, when Tom Maxwell, the guy who has come to takes photos on Indian society and all, we see that there are two moments of, let's say, retribution here. It is the last Feluda.
There's some network issue.
Dead Hiralal. He has kicked Hiralal dead, and Hiralal was a forefather. Uh, Hiralal was a forefather of the police inspector, Sudarshan Chobe. And Sudarshan takes out his revenge on Tom because both of them are descendants of Hiralal and Reginald. Because Reginald kicked Hiralal dead, Sudarshan hits Tom in the head once. And Feluda solves the crime. He knows that Sudarshan had hit Tom, but he forgives Sudarshan. He says that ঠিক আছে আমি জানি আপনি এটা করেছেন কিন্তু ঠিক আছে ছেড়ে দিন. But there is also a message of non-violence, a definite message of non-violence, where this same Tom, he starts taking pictures of a funeral happening, and Feluda says that he is doing something very foolish because Tom is definitely hurting the sentiments of Indian people. Even just not supposed to take pictures of a funeral, it is supposed to be a sacred event. And the local boys who were performing the cremation, they get furious and they want to hit Tom as a fit retribution. Feluda intervenes. He comes, raises his hands, and there is that illustration by Subroto Gangobadhyay where Feluda is actually raising his hand at that particular moment as a Christ-like figure, and he says that শোনো এই সাহেব তো আমাদের ব্যাপার স্যাপার জানেন না, ইনি যা করেছেন করেছেন, তোমরা আর দয়া করে প্রতিশোধ নিতে যেও না, and then those people, they get furious. They are like, who the hell are you, apni kon horidas pala amader ki korbo na korbo bolar. And when they get to know that he is, well, Pradosh Chandra Mitra, they are like, আরে স্যার আমরা তো আপনার ফ্যান, আচ্ছা আচ্ছা ঠিক আছে, আমরা সাহেবকে কিছু করবো না, ছেড়ে দিলাম. Feluda himself is also definitely giving a message of non-violence here. Violence begets violence. That's definitely not supportive. So yeah, that's about it. And what was the second question, by the way? Okay, there are no more questions, maybe.
Yeah, no, no,
Yeah,
no. There is a
that's it.
question. Sorry, I muted myself. Yeah. Are his works
Okay,
challenging the capitalist
do his works
rationalism?
challenge the
To what
capitalist
extent they are based
rationalism? To
on
what
Indian
extent are they
reality?
based on Indian reality? Yeah, they definitely challenged capitalist rationalism. Yeah, that's exactly why he brings in so much paranormal and ghosts in his stories, and that's exactly why Shonku, in spite of being a scientist, he keeps on saying this line throughout his works, almost on a rote. It's like, আমি একজন বৈজ্ঞানিক, কিন্তু আমার জীবনে এমন অনেক ঘটনা ঘটেছে যেগুলো বৈজ্ঞানিক সূত্র দিয়ে বোঝানো যায় না. And then he also says things like, যদিও আমি বৈজ্ঞানিক, আমি বরাবরই আমার মনে হয়েছে কোনো একজন অদৃশ্য শক্তি যেন আমাকে উপর থেকে পরিচালনা করছে. These are all paranormal realizations. And Shonku himself had a tantric forefather, Botukeshwar Shonku. Satyajit was probably thinking of his own tantric forefather, Loknath Rai. So definitely challenging capitalist rationalism. I mean, how else will you explain a scientist like Shonku getting challenged by uh, uh, Pretsiddha Sadhu in Professor Shonku Har, or an Oriental magician in Professor Shonku Chiching? Uh, but I mean, hell, he's a scientist, but he has seen ghosts. He has seen his own forefather's ghost. And then he also discovers another machine which actually brings up uh, live specters in Shonkur Porolok Chorcha. They call up Beethoven's spirit, they call up Sirajdollah spirit, they call up Hitler's spirit, they call up a pterodactyl spirit, for God's sake. And there's a live demonstration of the pterodactyl flying high. And even in Feluda, I mean, that is definitely, I mean, strange, because Feluda is a detective. He is also another person where, I mean, and Feluda is not fantasy. Shonku is science fantasy. Feluda is definitely realism, and he is a detective. But even in Feluda, we find a Jatishwar boy staring pretty at you. He's like, আমি তো জন্মাই, আমি তো বড় হইনি, আমি তো রুটি খাই. And then the baffled parapsychologist is like, রুটি খাও, খেতে না খাও? And he's like, খেতাম. And then when he says দুষ্টু লোক, the villain says, গত জন্মে না এই জন্মে. So that boundary keeps on getting torn, the boundary between the normal and the paranormal. He keeps on moving to and fro between his two births. So that's definitely something which challenges rationality. uh, and uh, yeah, Indian reality. It- that is all Satyajit is writing about, right? Because I mean, where else to challenge rationalism? I mean, India definitely offers a very good place. I mean, it is definitely India where a reputed scientist like Professor Shonku, India of the mid 60s, let's say, he could come face to face with a Pret Siddha Sadhu, like in Professor Shonku Hard. Because in India, all these things, they are still prevalent. I mean, it is definitely in India where two urban men could come face to face with a sadhu petting a live snake called Balkishan. I mean, India offers you that space where uh, there is already that mercantile capitalism creeping in space, but there is also an alternative space available, very much. When you go to non-urban places, you can still find people falling for let's say, mm, superhuman sadhus like mostly Baba. So India offers Ray that space to question rationalism. And yeah, how to understand Professor Shonku's exclusive living in a place away from city? Very good question. Because living away from city actually gives him. There are two reasons I would say. One is that living away from city gives him that space to come face to face with alternative realities. If he was living in a claustrophobic city like Calcutta, it would have been a bit hard for him to come face to face with somebody like the Prechiddha Sadhu of Professor Shonku Had, or the spirit of his own grandfather. I mean, ghosts do not simply walk. I mean, it's a it's a challenge for a ghost to walk about in broad daylight in a place like Calcutta. Like Botukeshwar Shonku spirit walks about merrily in Giridi, it would have been a challenge for Botukeshwar to walk about like that in Calcutta. And in that connection, it reminds me of Narayan Gangobadhyay's Charmurti, where I mean, it's বেলা when Kabla says that এই ভূতগুলো সবসময় রাত্রির বেলা হাসে কেন রে, আর সবসময় এইসব জায়গায় এরকম হাসে কেন, and then Tala says আরে ভূত তো রাতেই হাসবে, ভূত কি দিনের বেলা কলেজ স্কোয়ারে বসে হাসবে নাকি? Uh, the place is very significant, College Square. What is Pala actually saying? দিনের বেলা কলেজ স্কোয়ার is a urban highly crowded place. It simply does not, it is not a suitable place for a spirit to be. And that's precisely why Satyajit takes Shonku away from the city, because Shonku has a generous sprinkling of the paranormal. It would have been a bit hard for him to bring that amount of paranormal and irrational in those stories if Shonku was living in, let's say, a claustrophobic place like Calcutta. Feluda can live there because Feluda stories do not have that kind of a thing. There is only one story of Feluda where there is a touch of the paranormal, the Jatishwar boy, and significantly that story, I mean, Calcutta is almost non-existent in that story. Sonarkela does not remind you of Calcutta, it reminds you of Rajasthan. And Rajasthan is a place of fairy tales where everything is possible, where a boy like Mukul seems highly probable. Because Rajasthan, of course, is a place of fairy tales. I mean, that is a place where Satyajit had gone for the first time to shoot a fantasy film, Gupigain Bagabain. And that is where his idea of Sonarkela, the story, came. Yeah, that's it. And also, Shonku lives in a place away from the city because this is, of course, not actually related to my topic, but I have also felt that Satyajit has presented Shonku as somebody living away from the city because Shonku is an unreal character. I mean, you can find a person like Feluda in mid-60s Calcutta. He has a boy next door image. I mean, he is very much grounded in the reality of those times. He is very much a mid-60 Calcutta, but not for Shonku. I mean, the kind of prestige and the kind of incredible talent Satyajit has shown in Shonku, and also the kind of respect he gets from various people. A third world scientist in the mid 60s getting that kind of adulation around the world, a person coming from a poor country. Satyajit was definitely stretching the frontiers of reality here. He knew Professor Shonku, a person like Professor Shonku, is impossible in real life India. I mean, there is a book by Shondip Rai where he says that বাবা হয়তো শঙ্কুর মধ্যে দিয়ে নিজে যে সম্মান অনেক সময় পাননি, সেই স্বাদটা যেন উনি শঙ্কুর মধ্যে দিয়ে পূরণ করেছেন। বাবা তো অনেক কিছুই করে গেছেন যেগুলোর জন্য ওনাকে সেরকম কোনো সম্মান দেওয়া হয়নি, যেহেতু উনি একটা গরিব দেশে বসে ছবি বানাতেন। শঙ্কুকে উনি দেখিয়েছেন যে এমন একজন লোক যে ওনার মতোই দানবীয় প্রতিভা সম্পন্ন এবং খুব অল্প পয়সায় সেও কাজ করে, পথের পাঁচালীর মতোই অল্প বাজেটে ওরকম একটা মারাত্মক জিনিস তুলে দেওয়ার মতো অল্প বাজেটে বিরাট বিরাট ডিসকভারি করে, কিন্তু সেই লোকটা কিন্তু ক্রেডিট পায় এবং তাকে সবাই ক্রেডিট দিতে উন্মুখ। We see he's getting adulations from this society and that society, honorary doctorates. Maybe Satyajit knew that this is not possible in India, and that he experienced it through his own life. A man living in a poor country like India simply does not get that much credit, and he was making Shonku as a kind of wish fulfillment figure. And wish fulfillment figures are definitely away from reality. They cannot be kept in a flesh and blood place like Calcutta. And Shonku significantly is almost torn away from his surrounding realities. I mean, nowhere does we see him. Strangely, we does not see him anywhere talking much about his neighbors or what is happening to the surrounding people. Nowhere. Only in Shoptoporni does Shornoporni does his father once say that Tilu parle gorib মানুষদের কিছু help করিস. It's only in that story, and that story is at the fag end of Shonku's corpus. That is the last completed story. After that, there are two incomplete stories: Intellectron and Drexel Islander Ghotona. Uh, 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 Throughout his corpus, Shonku almost never talks about his surrounding people. There is only one person whom he talks about more than once, Abhinash Babu. Jotin Samadar, the inspector, gets talked about in the beginning in one or two stories. But then Shonku's stories get aggressively international. He does not talk about his own people. We almost know nothing about the people he lives amidst. I mean, there is I mean, when I read the Shonku stories, for a long time I didn't even know that Shonku lived in Bihar. Giridi was in Bihar. It's only some years before that my mom told that Giridi is actually, I mean, it's Deoghar, it's Bihar. It's then that I came to know that okay, that is the state where he lived. I mean, I knew nothing about his surrounding place, the people he lives amongst, and that's probably because he's a wish fulfillment figure. He does not read newspapers when he is going through an important experiment. He does not read newspapers. Avinash Babu comes and tells him, "Ajker kagozta dekhechen?" He is so cut off from from his surrounding. He is a complete loner, probably because he's a wish fulfillment figure. So yeah, that's it.
Hello? Yeah, okay. Thank you, Biproda. We have one question from Rajeshwar Gupta. We'll take his second question first. Would you say Shonku living far from the madding crowd and conducting his research in Giridi has
Yeah,
something to do
I'm done.
with the idea of ancient Indian cities
Ah, Rajorshida.
living in
Yeah.
Topopon?
Yes, this is another angle. He's, I mean, as I answered before, his figure itself takes a lot from that idea of the Indian sage, and Shonku living in Giredi in complete seclusion, it definitely takes some influence from that idea. The pre-modern sage, cut off from the madding crowd, living in tapovanas, and somebody not getting influenced by wealth. And Shonku lives in very close. I mean, again, tapovan very significant because Shonku lives in, I mean, he intentionally lives in close contact with nature. He regularly goes for a walk beside Usri. So that's something which he regularly does. He's somebody who lives in close communion with nature. So there, the image of the sage living in Topoban comes very much. And just like the deer playing around, the munis and rishis, the deers, the peacocks, we have Newton, we have Dhimu, we have the macaw, we have corvus. There are a lot of animal beings, non-human beings surrounding Shonku in his secluded life. So yeah, uh, definitely, definitely so.
And another question is asking it's about Khogom, one of my very favorite texts. Would you like to view Khogom as a narrative of clash of values, that is, the self-centered, Eurocentric urban culture versus the Oriental,
Yeah,
inclusive
definitely
culture?
so. Because that is what Khogom actually tries to show. Because that is what the story Khogom is, uh, if I may say so, pretty much plagiarized from, talks about. Khogom is, I will not use a more hard word. Let's say it is heavily influenced by a Rudyard Kipling story, The Mark of the Beast, where a couple of sahibs, they go to a Hanuman temple, and there is one unbelieving sahib who takes a cigarette stub and puts it on the idol's forehead, and then there is Then there is a sage who kind of tells him that the curse will be on you, the mark of the beast will be on you, and then eventually that sahib gets transformed into a wolf overnight. So that's actually the story of Khogom also, because Kipling was definitely talking about that worldview towards the late Victorian. This is where I'm getting into my PhD thesis. Towards the late Victorian period, there was a definite questioning of their own rationality by the English. I mean, they were getting more and more due to several reasons. There was the rise of Germany and the United States. There was the decreased demand of English industrial goods. Then there was the Boer War. The English confidence received some blows during the late Victorian period, and that is also the period where maybe that is the reason why we find a lot of late Victorian writers who are sitting back and they are analyzing their worldview. I mean, it's like, is there something wrong in the way we see the world, and the way we have underestimated the colonized people? Have we made a mistake? Are they actually more strong, and is there more in their culture? Are they more virulent than we have actually made themselves out to be? Because those mid-Victorian allegations of the Bengali being a feminine cowardly race by Macaulay and Thackeray and whatnot, the idea of the feminine, the colonized people, uh, it's actually getting challenged during this period. The idea of the powerless colonized, we see people from the margins creating a problem. Dracula comes from Transylvania. In Richard Marsh's Beetle, there is a beetle which travels from Egypt and creates problems in London. In a lot of Sherlock Holmes stories, the problem actually comes from the colonies. In Sign of the Four, the Agra treasure comes to London and creates problems. So, just like that, in Rudyard Kipling's story, we also get to see that the Eurocentric rationalism is getting challenged, and the Indian god, who was treated as contemptuous and meaningless in mid-Victorian discourse, uh, it is actually shown to be powerful, uh, at least powerful enough to cause harm. And that's exactly the worldview which Ray takes in Kogom as well. Two Indians, but nevertheless armed with that aggressive rationalism. And it's literally aggressive, right? The guy is attacking the snake, and he's like, he gleefully exclaims, "One Kyote less," and then he gets the payback. Uh, it's definitely challenging that kind of rationalism. The self-centered Eurocentric urban culture is definitely self-centered, because he's killing a life form, whereas the Oriental culture is much more inclusive, because the Imli Baba, he actually he knows that these people have come from the city. It might well be that they don't believe in uh, the paranormal and magical creatures, but he still, nevertheless, he agrees to show them Balkishan. So it is there when he is actually becoming inclusive, that he is following that Otiti Narayan kind of philosophy. That, yeah, since they have come to my place, I will show them the snake. And then we find that aggressive urban man who is actually attacking the snake, and who is, let's say, who is abusing the agency given to him as a guest. So that's definitely a clash between the self-centered Eurocentric urban culture and the inclusive Oriental culture.
Thank you, Bipruda. Now we have question from Tulika. But surprisingly, some young society men of that capitalist society used to buy Prokhor Rudra series written by Lal Mohan Ganguly. Although some of them bought books for their youngs, but is not it little hard to believe that one middle-aged man who constantly writes Goenda series being in that capitalist society where young beings just believe their monetary value and becomes famous and rich as he bought his own car later. If Satyajit Ray only wrote filler series and not made films or wrote any other series or short stories, can he be as popular as Jota is in his fiction?
Prokhor Rudra, I think it is a way in which Satyajit he delivers his condemning sentence on a lot of things. For example, Prokhor Rudra is actually built on that superheroic American image which I was talking about, which Gupi Bagha forms an alternative to. Prokhor Rudra uses a lot of violence, and Prokhor Rudra is actually a superhero, right? Khanar moto nak, I mean, in Darjeeling Jonjamar Topse says that লালমোহন বাবু যেরকম বর্ণনা দিয়েছিলেন প্রখর রুদ্র, সারা বাংলাদেশে এরকম লোক পাওয়া যেত না। খাড়ার মতো নাক, 6.5 ফুট লম্বা, 56 ইঞ্চি, না 56 ইঞ্চি ছাতি is for someone else, 57 ইঞ্চি ছাতি, however, anyway, so uh, that's unbelievable. And that's where and that's what the American hero is like, right? I mean, if you look at Superman's chati, I mean, that's unbelievably broad, and then such a small waist. I mean, how could he balance his broad chest on such a thin waist? It's anatomically impossible. It will break. And then the kind of impossible things which Jatayu wrote, 14টা গুলি মেরে 15 জনকে ঘায়েল করে দিল, তারপর কুমিরের মুখের মধ্যে ঢুকে গিয়ে আবার লেজ দিয়ে বেরিয়ে এলো, those kind of things. Those are the things perhaps which Satyajit did not support, and Jatayu is actually another example of what capitalism can do to the artistic sense of a writer. Because Jatayu is not a good writer. He is a good human being, but he is not at all a good writer. Satyajit makes it very clear in the Feluda stories. And Feluda himself says, আপনি তো যা লেখেন মানে তার বেশিরভাগই থোড় বড়ি খাড়া, নয়তো খাড়া বড়ি থোড়. But Jatayu writes on and on and on. Why? Because his books sell. They sell like hot kochuris, following his own words. And that is why he must write at least twice per year. একটা বৈশাখে, একটা পুজোয়. And for him, writing is basically another capitalistic job. He's not doing it for doing art. He makes it pretty clear. That's how he makes his living. He says that লিখে পয়সা করা যায়, এটা আমি আমার পরিবারের লোকজনদের দেখিয়ে দিচ্ছি. And he actually buys a car with the money. He is definitely more solvent than Feluda. That's pretty obvious. I mean, that is also something Topse mentions in Darjeeling Jomjamat. But there is also another bottom line which is carried on throughout the Feluda stories, that Jatayu is completely compromising on his artistic duty by writing those Prokhor Rudra stories, because they are trash. I mean, it's something like Edgar Rice Burroughs writing Tarzan novels one after another. As Burroughs made it clear, I write them only because they give me money. That is also why Jatayu's stories are filled with those informational bloopers. It's like the Ruter Pakostoli and that Godilar Gogras, and then he dedicates one book to Tenzing Norgay, right? While he's still alive, he dedicates it to the memory of Tenzing Norgay. And when Feluda says, "Ki korechen mosai, to ekhono beche ache," and then he's like, "Oh, আমি ভেবেছিলাম নোরকে বোধহয় অলরেডি পাহাড়ে পা ফা হড়কে মরে গেছে, ও মরেনি, ও আচ্ছা ঠিক আছে." মানে he is that much uninformed, but he still keeps on writing, and writing a lot. So that's definitely a condemnation of capitalistic society. I mean, this is what capitalist society makes of an artist, because Jatayu might be a bad artist, but he's an artist nevertheless. He writes well. He might write trash, but the man is a good writer, because as Topse says in Boshpugure Khun Kharapi, Jatayu himself says, after seeing that Binapani Bharat Opera's natok, আমার গল্পের জাগুন এরও তাই, একবার শুরু করলে জমে যেতে হয়, কিন্তু মনকে টানার শক্তি আছে পুরোপুরি, কিন্তু তলিয়ে দেখুন দেখবেন অনেক ফাঁক অনেক ফাঁকি। এন্ড দেন তোরসে সেজ, কথাটা লালমোহন বাবু ঠিকই বলেছেন, কারণ ওনার লেখাগুলো বেশিরভাগই ফেলুদার কথায় তোর বড়ি খাড়া খাড়া বড়ি তোর, কিন্তু ভদ্রলোক লেখেন ভালো, একবার শুরু করলে জমে যেতে হয়। হি ইজ a good writer. If he was more dedicated to his, let's say, artistic philosophy, and let's say less bothered about money, he might have written good novels, because he's a great, he can write well, he can attract people. But since he has that compulsion to write twice every year, whether he gets a good plot or not, he keeps on writing trash. But the trash is well written again. So Jatayu has potential, but Ray makes it clear that capitalist society ultimately does this to a man. And I will so far go to say as Jatayu also represents an anxiety in Ray's own mind, because Ray himself was also a filmmaker who ultimately Ray did not make his money from his writing, so to say. I mean, once when he was not really bothered about making money from his writing, because he was writing uh, uh, for his family magazine. There was no, let's say, directly economic compulsion while writing. And when he, for the first time, when he wrote a Feluda for Desh, Sagarmoy Ghosh later says that when I paid the money, he looked at me with a strange expression and says, "अरे बस लिखेও তাহলে পয়সা পাওয়া যায় আমি তো জানতামই না." But there is another thing which he was making where he actually had to think about money, and that is his films. And there was a period when his films were not doing well. They were doing very bad at the box office. That is when he made Gupika in Bagabain. Before making Gupika in Bagabain, his films were doing drearily bad in the box office, and he was not getting producers. And then he was like, he almost said that, okay, this is almost like back to the days of Potter Pachali, searching for a director, searching for a producer. So, and when he made Gupika in Bagabain, R.D. Bonsal actually said that I will not give you money for this film because I don't think this film will, uh, people will see this film. So, not maybe as a writer, but as a filmmaker, Satyajit always had to fight with that temptation himself, to make films for the market or to make films for art. And he always chose a kind of middle path, as we saw. He was not overly revolutionary in his filmmaking. He was within the bound of traditionalist filmmaking, realist filmmaking. He never did something as revolutionary as Mrinal Sen breaking the fourth wall in interview, where Ranjit Mullik faces the crowd and says, "Amar naam Ranjit Mullik." He does not do that. He remains within a bound, but he also remains committed to his artistic ideals. He does not completely give in to market, and that is also why he was so angry about Bombay filmmaking, right? Because he felt that they were only making trash for money. And Lal Mohan Babu once starts writing films, stories for Bombay films. That's very significant, because Lal Mohan realizes টাকাটা heavy দেয়, and that's probably the only thing he writes for, right? He writes for money. So that is an example. Lal Mohan, I will say, he's an example of what the temptation of money in a capitalist world does to a man who probably had potential to become a good artist. And Lal Mohan is a fear which plays in Satyajit's mind. Lal Mohan is somebody whom Satyajit will not become. And that is why he will never write trash like Prokhar Rudra. He will always keep on writing healthy uh, detective stories like Feluda. So, yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Biprada. We don't have much questions now. We have many comments in the chat box. Protim, can you check if we have any more questions?
Actually, I think there are some more comments, but due
Okay,
to
okay.
paucity
Yeah,
of
there are
time,
many
I think
comments.
we might in this session here. But anyway, I think participant can write their questions and comments. I mean, in both mail form
Yeah,
or
yes.
something.
If you
They
have
can
any
reach to
more
Viproda
questions, you can reach to
if they are
Biprada
like
or
willing
us as
to
well.
know more about it. Yes.
Yes. Thank you so much to all the participants for listening to us today, and thank you, Bipuda, for joining us today. It was an amazing lecture. We had a lovely evening amidst
Thank you.
this pandemic time.
The pleasure is
Every day
entirely
in the
mine.
morning, we are getting such bad news, and this kind of lectures
Yeah,
and this kind of motivation keeps us going. Thank you so much.
the pleasure
Thank
is
you.
entirely
Thank
mine.
you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And to all our viewers and participants,
Thank
thank
you
you for
everyone.
being with us on this journey because we know it is devastating for all of us in this pandemic, in this COVID-19 situation. We all are mentally and physically exhausted. But still, thank you for being with us. And now I'll ask Protim to deliver the formal vote of thanks for today. Protim, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Aratrika. I hope my network is working well. So, on the behalf of the team Calcutta Comparatists 1919, a hearty thanks to Dr. Bipranarayan Bhattacharyya for his amazing lecture on this new sort of thing. I think which is like very interesting, and the neoliberal aspect which he was talking about today is like I find it's like very interesting. So anyway, I'd like to express our gratitude to Biproda for responding to us and coming to our forum, and we are really inspired by his great words. And thank you to all our audience on YouTube for being with us today. And here we officially conclude this session now. Very good night to everyone, and thank you again, Biproda. So yes.
Thank you. Good night to all of you. Thank you.
Good night. Good night.